Well, thank you all. It's quite a movie and quite some movie making you guys do here at Asan. Welcome back for all of you. This is our East Asian Power Shift plenary session. I'm David Sanger, and we're hoping to spend our time until 10:15 discussing how the differing relationships between the four major powers that are represented on the stage here are going to reorient themselves given all that we discussed yesterday. The U.S., of course, has been, by some accounts, an offshore balancer. By other accounts, a Pacific nation that either never left or is pivoting back. China's rise we've discussed at some length and we'll be discussing again. And we have to figure out here how Japan and South Korea reorient themselves to these realities as well and influence those events. And we've got a very good panel to deal with all these issues. From the U.S., we have my old friend Jim Steinberg, Dean of the Maxwell School, and of course former Deputy Secretary of State. We have Dr. Yunzhu, who's the director of the China Center on the Center on China-American Defense Relations, and is a major general in the PLA and senior fellow of the Academy of Military Sciences. Professor Yoshihide is professor, of course, of political science and international relations at Keio, at the Faculty of Law, and the director of the Center for Contemporary Korean Studies at the Institute of East Asian Studies at Keio. And Dr. Kim Sung-han, immediately to my left here, the director of the Ilman International Relations Institute and a professor of international relations at Korea University at the Graduate School of International Studies. So, Jim, let me start with you and ask you to sort of pick up on the discussion that you were having yesterday, but with a little more of a focus on how you believe the four countries that we've been discussing the most here and that are represented here on the stage are going to figure out how to accommodate themselves, and how do they actually even come to any common understanding of how they should go do that? Because I think one of the big lessons from yesterday is that the degree of real communication on that issue is something that has been somewhat missing. We've got a lot of shouting back and forth, we have a lot of signal sending. We don't have a lot of real discussion going on among the four powers about how to make this work.
Thanks, David. I mean, I think the real challenge is to try to envision what if not a stable equilibrium, at least a kind of a manageable dynamic equilibrium would be like in the region, given the changes that are taking place in the economic capacity and the development of military capabilities of the countries of the region. We have, in international relations, only a couple of models about how to manage these things. Polarity, multipolarity, bipolarity, but they don't really answer the question about how is it that the nations can relate to each other in a way that gives each enough sense of security without threatening the other. And that is the dilemma, given the nature of the technologies of security now, that it's sort of hard to see how you get this environment. In the old days in Europe, as you know, David, these people used to talk about defense of defense, and could we possibly manage to structure ourselves in a way in which we gave ourselves real security, defensive security, without posing any insecurity in the other. And I think that's just not plausible. I think the technologies of defense don't allow us to do that. So what would it look like? I think it's clear that the model of the past, which depended on a relatively demilitarized Japan supported by an offshore United States as kind of the core of security, is just not going to be sustained. Japan, for a variety of reasons, I think is no longer going to be content to that level of both dependence on the United States and low level of capacity. So what would be manageable for everybody? One would like to say a collective security agreement. I mean, that would be kind of the first best choice. But given the tensions in the region, it's very difficult to imagine. We can't even get a collective security agreement to work in Europe along the model of the OSCE now, and it's even harder to imagine there. So I think the question is going to be, can the countries of the region develop a political forum that allows them to deal with some of these issues, whether it's six-party talks becoming a political forum that goes beyond just dealing with the North Korea nuclear question, and then some understandings about the degree of military capability that each will have. And I continue to believe that none of this will work if the United States is not involved. That's the one thing that actually creates the opportunity for, particularly for Japan, to have some degree of security without being totally reliant on its own capability, which raises the specter that nobody likes to talk about further nuclear capabilities in the region.
You mentioned, and I just wanted to follow up on one element, just have you say a few more sentences on it. You said some understanding of what kind of military capabilities each would have. But of course, yesterday when we were discussing nuclear capabilities, you made the point that you've seen a range of other capabilities sort of step in their place. So would an agreement among the powers in Asia have to go beyond military as well to surveillance technologies, cyber technologies, even financial power that they may have in controlling trade routes?
Well, I don't think the answer is an agreement. I think we're just not going to repeat the Washington Naval Convention. It didn't work once, and it's not going to work a second time, because there are just too many ways around it, and these are not amenable to formal kinds of agreements. But I do think there are issues of restraint. And so one of the issues that's been a big issue here, and is an issue with respect to Taiwan, and can be an issue with respect to Japan, is the question of developing offensive ballistic missile capabilities, right? And so while we're not going to get an INF type agreement in this region, it's important for both Korea and Japan to think about the consequences of what happens if you develop these long-range strike capabilities in terms of the way your neighbors feel about it. And so this is a case, as we talked about yesterday, where forms of unilateral restraint, hopefully reciprocated by others exercising restraint, can help build a bit of confidence and to focus on those capabilities. It's imperfect, but we've had a lot of experience in the context of Taiwan in thinking about how do you modulate these things. I mean, the United States is committed to providing defensive weaponry to Taiwan, but we think a lot about, as we make these arms sales, how not to try to destabilize the relationship. So we try to be careful. It's imperfect, but at least it reflects an attempt to deal with the question of giving security and confidence without posing too much of a threat to the other.
So Dr. Yao, let me turn this to you. So you've heard what Jim has said out here. The history of these things is that rising powers tend, at least while they're rising, not to be particularly interested in these kinds of agreements, because if anything, they can limit one's ability, and you don't know what the world's going to look like in 5 years or 10 years or 15 years. And many of the additional technologies that one could use as a substitute or supplement to nuclear power are also evolving very quickly. So it would be hard, as Jim says, to even reach one kind of these agreements when you don't know what those are going to look like in the future. Given that, what are China's incentives to enter into the kind of structure that Jim's just proposed?
So what is the current security architecture in East Asia or in Asia Pacific? I think it's the American-dominated alliance system. America had 5 alliances in the region, and based on that alliances system, the United States have been able to build partnerships, and this is the current security architecture in East Asia, in Asia Pacific. And this architecture had been inherited from the Cold War period. And during the Cold War period, this architecture is to counter or contain the former Soviet Union. And at one time, it was to contain China as well. But after I think this architecture survived the Cold War, and it also the implication to China, especially the implication to cross Taiwan Straits scenario, also survived the Cold War. So China is never included in the current security architecture, and China had never been comfortable with the current existing security system in Asia. To be honest, I think that China has said that it's going to rise peacefully, and China has been doing so, has been making efforts to rise peacefully, economically, politically, and in other aspects. But it is very difficult for China so far to rise peacefully in military terms. Because when the United States, when they talk about we welcome a prosperous and constructive and stable China, I don't think that prosperous and strong China had a military element in it. Because since 1989, the sanctions has been imposed on China, including arms embargo, including the prohibition of high-tech export to China, and this kind of sanctions are still on. So how can China really perceive the existing alliance-based, centered Asia security architecture as a friendly or a good thing for the military to join in, or for China to incorporate it? And so far there has not been much gestures, welcoming gestures from this architecture from a Chinese perspective.
So when you talk to Americans about the Chinese strategy, what you hear the most, particularly if you talk to people in the Pentagon, what you hear from the most is China's strategy at this point is push the U.S. and its allies, but mostly the U.S., out to the second island chain, create a sphere of influence not unlike what the United States did in parts of the Western Hemisphere, and only then begin to discuss what that new structure should look like. Is that, if in fact the conversation even happens then, is that in fact an accurate description of a Chinese strategy that you recognize in any way?
I don't think the Pentagon officers would like to openly see things like that you only come to the second or first or second island chain that will fill your...
Secretary Gates said as much when he visited China 4 years ago.
I think the thing is that China is traditionally a land power, but the Chinese Navy is gaining capabilities and is operating further away from its homeland, from its territory. And this is something that the United States military may be concerned about. But China has never clearly drawn a line, the first island chain or the second island chain as the boundary, a kind of sphere of influence for the Chinese military power. And the Chinese security concerns are mostly in its maritime concerns are mostly in its periphery area, and it mostly concerns with territory disputes.
Well, since you've raised territorial disputes, this takes us quite naturally to Professor Yoshihide. As you listen to what you've now heard from Dean Steinberg, from Dr. Yao, tell us how you think Japan would see a reordered system. Is Jim right that the existing status quo, in which Japan has a relatively low military capability and is highly dependent on the U.S., is not sustainable here? And if so, what are the implications of that?
Thank you. Before getting into that, small correction, my last name is Soeya. Sorry, they put Asian names with last name first. But, well, maybe, well, first of all, I don't think there is anything like Japanese thinking or Japanese strategy, you know, as agreed even among central decision makers. And I have my own, but I don't know whether which I should present here. But first, I'd like to question the assumption of that question, your question, which is what Jim said, whether or not Japan would be able to remain content with the current structure of fundamentally depending upon the United States. I think that question is very critical because alternative could either be, you know, Japan militarily and otherwise rebounding, or accepting China-centered order. And temptation for some could be the first, and which is exactly what we tend to hear from our current leader. And but I myself do not believe that's possible. What Prime Minister Abe is doing is not necessarily to rebound, you know, from the current state, but rather perhaps slow the process of Japan's decline, perhaps, and buy time, and eventually restructure the kind of post-war system which is premised on the alliance with the United States. So how alliance functions may become different. And it's not only about China. And today I think we are sort of being bothered by the return of geopolitics, the elements of power politics perhaps. And the alliance of course has the function of dealing with those geopolitical dimensions. But I think the other important function of the alliance in the much broader context is to lessen the incentives of geopolitics. And I don't think anybody is interested in and happy about you know, accepting the return of geopolitics as the reality. So if that's the case, sort of prescription should direct that, I think, towards some other direction. And Japan and the US and others, and South Korea is terribly important for that sort of new orientation of national strategy of Japan, or for that matter, not for Japan alone, for South Korea too. I'm very much convinced to talk to each other in you know, dealing with reality, of course, but in contemplating a somewhat, you know, alternative scenario, which could lessen the dangers, and including territory issues, of course. And this could be only an academic attempt for the moment, but I think that sort of attempt at the civil society level and the academic level, I think is going to have a big impact in years ahead.
Well, let me press you on something that you said at the outset there, which I think was true, and I think you said it very well. You said you don't think that there is anything like a Japanese strategy, even among the major decision makers. And you wrote a very interesting essay, I remember, in Japan as a normal country. And normal country was a phrase that used to be used a lot by Japanese politicians to describe a country that would have, among other things, more of its own normal military, its own normal decision-making, and would be a little bit less dependent on the decision-making that was made by a large ally and protector. Why do you think it is? That discussion began probably 20 years ago, right? I mean, that was when the phrase first came up in Japanese politics.
In the 90s. Yeah.
That's a long time to begin to develop a long-term strategy at a moment when China's rise was becoming increasingly evident, and the issues with other neighbors, including Korea, particularly with South Korea, were also pretty predictable. What is it about the Japanese system that it has been unable to develop even a discussion about an independent strategy on this issue?
Well, quick answer to the last point is independent strategy for Japan, if there is such a thing, I think is still continue to be premised on the alliance with the United States. It's a contradiction. Dependence on the US is the foundation of independent strategy. But I think that's a reality about so-called Japanese strategy, which means without the United States, we cannot come up with effective strategy, so to speak, independent strategy to deal with whatever issues in our neighborhood, Korean Peninsula, future of Korean Peninsula, and the rise of China. There is no such thing as Japan coping with the rise of China single-handedly, but in its own. There is no such thing. And so that's, I think, that the quick answer to your last point. But coming back to the concept of a normal country, I think that's the impression that many indeed embrace. That is, normal country is a common phrase used by the Japanese and the leaders, but that's not true. For instance, I've never heard of Abe talking about normal country. And I've never heard of many other Japanese leaders using the phrase normal country. It's been used by outside observers. And please correct me if I'm wrong. And that's my, I didn't do any detailed research on this, but that's my observation. And I think the reason being, as you said, David, correctly, this concept started to be debated in the 1990s after Japanese LDP politician Ozawa used the term. And, but in the 1990s, when this concept originally came, it was rather internationalist argument. The motive was internationalism rather than nationalism. And the point about Japan having to become normal has to do with, first of all, the assessment of Japan's post-war experiences, whereby we have not done anything positive toward international security. We were shying away too much with one-country pacifism. So we have to break that mold, and we have to be more active in international peacekeeping and so forth. So that was the single most important issue when Japan started this debate. And the trigger was, of course, trauma and tragic failure in contributing to multilateral efforts to deal with Saddam Hussein, the invasion of Kuwait. We couldn't do anything. We failed even in sending our medical doctors of defense forces because for the single reason that they are the part of our military. So that was stopped in a national debate and the NIAT debate. So the extent of post-war pacifism was in a way too extreme. That was the assumption of this debate. And it's purely an internationalist argument. And the revision of Article 9 has started to become kind of accepted, if not by the majority, but by several people, particularly specialists in international politics and foreign policy, including myself. But the Article 9 division was also an internationalist agenda, because the assumption again was Article 9 prevented us from playing a due responsible international role in international security. That was our debate, and that was our self-consciousness. But eventually this concept started to be interpreted outside of Japan as symbolizing Japan becoming nationalistic and moving in the direction of military independence. To us, to be frank, that's silly, totally nonsense. That's why I wanted to cope with this concept in my recent book, about normal Japan. I wanted to correct that terribly misplaced assumption of this concept, which is a source of unnecessary confusion in East Asian international relations to me, to be frank. So that's why we stopped using the concept, because it doesn't tell anything about our real debate, and it has its own context outside of Japan. So that's sort of my take on this concept of normal Japan. So normal Japan means, again, the right of collective self-defense is of course important for Japan to become normal, because Korea has it, Australia has it, Canada has it, but Japan doesn't. I mean, we say we have the right, but we cannot exercise. So the right of collective self-defense simply strengthens the alliance with the United States. But our confusion comes from the fact that somewhat, nationalistic people are promoting this internationalist agenda. So that's somewhat contradiction. So U.S. doesn't like our nationalists, but they like the substance. So my argument is, in the 1990s, we've been doing rather well. Internationalists, liberal internationalists were leading this discussion with that motive. So there are some extent of acceptance by Koreans, right? President Kim Dae-jun and Obuchi, historic reconciliation, I think was premised on Korean reasonable understanding of Japanese motives, if not in the Korean general public or mass media necessarily. And so in the 1990s, that happened, but for all kinds of reasons. In my way of describing this, I mean, nationalists began to hijack internationalist agenda in the course of development of this at the turn of the century. So we are now there. So U.S. understand this, so they don't like these motives, but they know, Japan's agenda cannot be, somewhat taken away by these somewhat nationalistic, urge. So it's a contradiction, yes. That's why our management of relations could become very complex and difficult from time to time. But in the end, I think U.S. is confident that substance of our changes is beneficial, for the U.S. And that's our take as well. So how to deal with our prime minister is not such a simplistic thing for us, for myself too. We have mixed feelings.
Well, thank you. That was actually one of the most interesting descriptions of the normal nation sort of conundrum that I've heard, and it will be right on President Obama's agenda when he lands in a few hours in Japan, right after 147 members of the Diet showed up at the Yasukuni Shrine yesterday. So
again, that's a product of a typical vicious cycle. Mm-hmm. The number keeps increasing because of this vicious cycle. Previously, it's only about 30-some. So it's now increasing. It's only because of the vicious cycle. Not because of they are becoming, nationalistic or ideologically accepting Yasukuni. No, it's a symbolic political action to express dissatisfaction of what's happening between Japan, China, Japan, Korea. So it's more political than anything else. Yeah.
Professor Kim, you've been very patient here. As you've heard this discussion, I think it's fair to say that South Korea has led a somewhat more independent policy, even while being dependent on the U.S. for the ultimate defensive backup. We saw 2 successive governments pursue a policy with North Korea that Washington did not at all embrace at the time. You have seen South Korea go off and very successfully begin to woo away China with a trade relationship that certainly didn't exist anywhere near that element 20 years ago, and has made the North feel all the more vulnerable as a result. But as you think about these different structures that we've been discussing here, that Jim Steinberg laid out, and then the frustrations that China is feeling that we heard from Dr. Yao, and then Professor Yoshihide's analysis, do you subscribe to any of these models that we've been talking about?
Thank you for asking such a very difficult question.
It's the second day. We're done with the easy stuff.
By the way, from the Korean perspective, we are trying to benchmark the European model even though Europe is struggling for the recent years, meaning we want to see the coexistence between a US-led bilateral alliances on the one hand and the multilateral security cooperation mechanism on the other, like we are witnessing in Europe, where we are having the US-led NATO system on the one hand, and as James Steinberg said, the OSCE, Organization of Security Cooperation in Europe. Likewise, from the Korean perspective, as an ally of the United States, we are having China, which is a #1 trading partner for South Korea. So that's why we aspire to come up with this kind of a peaceful coexistence between two different mechanisms. That is our one point. And I want to stress out. And secondly, as we already have witnessed, the United States and China are competing while cooperating. United States has been maintaining kind of a predominant strategic status in the so-called Western Pacific area, where China is challenging the U.S. hegemonic status. If this kind of a U.S.-China relationship is going toward kind of intensified rivalry or competition, Korea, as a country who has to solve the North Korean problem, so-called, is having some trouble, because in resolving, for example, the North Korean nuclear problem, the Chinese support is indispensable. If United States is putting more focus, more priority on checking China or rise of China, if Japan is put first emphasis on how to encircle China, I think Korea is likely to feel the North Korean problem is being put into the back burner for those countries, the United States and China and Japan. So that's why this is kind of a dilemma for Korea. So I think in that sense, Korea has been emphasizing kind of the coexistence between these two different mechanisms. And thirdly, picking up what Professor Soeya has just mentioned, about the right to collective self-defense, because this is related with the Korea-Japan ties. Right to collective self-defense is stipulated in the UN Charter. Okay, so there is no reason that is being denied to Japan. But our problem is that Japan is trying to expand that right to make Japan a country who can conduct a war. That is my impression. So in that sense, the Japanese political leaders, particularly Prime Minister Abe, should make a clear distinction, okay, between so-called becoming a normal state, the pursuit of a normal state status, from taking the path of so-called ideological right. I think ideological right pursued this kind of a path to make Japan a country who can conduct a war, not just having the right to collective self-defense. So if this kind of a clear distinction is made, I think there is no reason Japan is being suspected by many neighboring countries. That was my last point. Thank you.
Let me just press you on one point here that you made at the beginning about your concern that because of these other agendas, no one is pressing the North Korean issue. I think it's fair to say that over the past 20 or 25 years, it has been South Korea as well that has not wanted to press the North too hard for fear of the issues that would come about if there was regime collapse, for fear of the issues that would come about if there was regime explosion. And so frequently when other countries were putting a lot of pressure on the North, we saw South Korea try to turn down the heat. And then at other moments when you've been more worried that other countries are distracted, we've seen South Korea raise the heat a little bit. Is that a fair critique? And would it be fair to say that while there's a lot of rhetoric about wanting to solve the North Korean problem, the South Korean leadership is not at all unified in really trying to seek a resolution?
As a person who served in the Lee Myung-bak government, I must confess I'm not a sunshiner.
We know that, yeah.
So I think it is time for us to test the real mind, to ask about the real mind of North Korea, who has conducted nuclear tests 3 times already, and who did a kind of a secret nuclear development program while they were having 1994 Geneva Agreed Framework. I think that North Korea is putting more emphasis on the forced nuclear test at the moment, rather than implementing so-called the 3 prior actions before coming to the 6-body talks. So I think sooner or later we need to propose to North Korea a kind of a comprehensive deal or a proposal in which you guys have to first implement prior actions before coming to the 6-body talks. Then, if he shows sincere attitude toward the denuclearization, we could start so-called peace forum among the 2 Koreas, China and the United States, to put an end to the Korean War legally. So this kind of a peace forum inauguration is stipulated in the 2005 September 19th agreement. So this kind of a proposal can be made to North Korea. Nevertheless, North Korea has flatly denied and conduct the forced nuclear test. I think China even has enough abundant reasons to get on board to put maximum pressure on North Korea. Previously, China was very helpful, but China didn't use her own resources by 100% to make North Korea change their attitude and policies. But if North Korea rejects this kind of a very progressive proposal, then China probably, hopefully, will get on board.
David, can I just, because I think it's very important that Dr. Kim brought the North Korea piece into this, because I think if you look at, sort of unpack this question about what a stable environment might be in the long term in the region, there are 3 probably key building blocks, or currently 3 stumbling blocks to making that happen. The first is, what will be the long-term resolution of the Korean Peninsula? What are the terms of the unification? What does that mean for the U.S.-Korean alliance, the stationing of U.S. troops? And there needs to be some understanding about that. And I believe that the conversations need to start now, as Dr. Kim has suggested, with China, which is as we had to ultimately resolve the status of Germany in connection with the coming together of Europe at the end of the Cold War. So there has to be some kind of understanding on everybody's side, so that when and if things collapse or end in the North, we don't have a crisis about what the long-term settlement should be there. And people have different views, but a conversation has to happen, and the key 3 parties, and if we can't get the North Koreans into it, it'd be even better if the North Koreans were part of it, need to have some understanding about what that world would like, because it will allow us to deal with that unanticipated crisis under whatever terms it's going to happen, just as the unanticipated collapse of the Berlin Wall precipitated something which nobody had really come to terms with, which was how we were going to resolve the question of Germany. So that's the first stumbling block. Second is Taiwan, which is out there, and I thought we had a pretty interesting conversation, although briefly, yesterday about that. But that will be part of, you know, an understanding about what's a long-term acceptable status for Taiwan. And the third are these issues around maritime operations and the territories. These are, I mean, there are lots of issues, but these are the places where if there can be some kind of understanding among the key parties about what framework to put them in, then I think we have a much better chance of evolving some kind of quasi-collective common framework within which those specific understandings should be carried out. But without coming to terms with those things, they're going to be out there as constant sources of tension and then potentially conflict.
Very good point. And let me ask Dr. Yao, we know from both the reports of some American negotiators, but also from the wonderful trove of WikiLeaks documents that got out a few years ago, that there have been quiet efforts with South Korea, the United States, and China to talk a little bit about the future of the Korean Peninsula should North Korea collapse, should the regime fall, and so forth. It's a very difficult conversation for the Chinese government to have, in part because they didn't want to be caught, as they said in these documents themselves, conducting that conversation at a moment that, you know, you've obviously got a relationship to maintain with North Korea. So how do you walk this line? Do you see in the Chinese government any willingness or any way to discuss the future of North Korea without appearing in that conversation to be completely undercutting the current North Korean regime, with whom, of course, the Chinese have got some issues as well?
I think you have correctly described this kind of conversation has to be quiet. If it has to be quiet, it's not for me to discuss it. But I want to use this chance to say something else.
Sure.
I think when we talk about power shift in East Asia, we have to keep in mind the interplay, the interactions between and among four developments. And most of the developments we have mentioned during our discussions yesterday. The first one is China's rise. China not only has risen, but has risen as a full-fledged power, not only an economic power, but also a political power and a military power to a certain extent. And the second thing is the U.S. rebalance toward Asia Pacific, and it happened 5 years ago. It has implications not only for China, but also for other regional players. And especially for China, and China really is watching closely whatever the U.S. government says about the rebalance, and how many times the U.S. government officials assured China that we are not going to contain China, but China is waiting to see how the United States would balance the need to reassure allies in the area, and at the same time positively engage China into regional affairs. And a second thing is that China has to evaluate the can't find my and China has to evaluate the what we talked about, the existing and the future mechanisms that the United States is dominating and is going to propose, and the regional mechanisms to deal with economic as well as security issues. Whether China is included, welcomed, incorporated into these mechanisms or excluded from these mechanisms. And for the People's Liberation Army, for the military, of which I'm still an active member, it is important to watch how much China is taken as a potential opponent in future military conflict, and how much China is considered in allies in multinational and joint military operations. So I think the second trend, the U.S. rebalance, I understand that it is based on the recognition, on the fact that U.S. has been in the Asia Pacific for more than 100 years, and the current rebalance is based on the deeper understanding that United States, the future of U.S. Prosperity and securities is closely linked with the prosperity and security of this region. But still, it caused a huge amount of concern. And I think both China and the United States have to work together to understand each other better, to relieve China's concern. And also, I think China's rise has raised concern not only to the United States, but also to other regional players. And China also has the responsibility, try to convince others that China's peaceful rise is genuine and it is going to be implemented as China has been incorporated, the way China has been incorporated into international economic systems. And the third development we have to keep in mind is the tension, the rising tension in maritime security issues. I have to note that it is not only between China and its neighbors, it happens among and between China's neighbors. For example, the 5 islands between DPRK and ROK, and the Dakto Island between ROK and Japan, and Northern Territory disputes between ROK and Japan, Russia and Japan, and also the South China Sea disputes between China's neighbors and among China's neighbors, not only between China and its neighbors. So all these kind of territorial disputes are happening. It had been happening in the past, but countries can move beyond it because they think a better bilateral relationship is much more important than disputes over territory, and we can actually just put it aside for a while. But because maybe, and in China it has been widely believed that the U.S. rebalance toward Asia Pacific had something to do with the rising tension in all these territory disputes, especially in East China Sea and South China Sea. And last development I have to mention, it also has a very important impact in East Asia power shift, is the power diffusion from the traditional player, international players, the state, to non-state actors like the social media, NGOs, private sectors, and even private citizens or netizens who have unprecedented power, and a personal view by a netizen's individual view can be amplified through a social medium thousands of times in the minute, in just a matter of minute. So it is opportunity, of course, but it also poses very serious challenges, especially when this kind of information age phenomena is combined with nationalism in East Asia. It has significant implications for policy making, for national policy making, as well as international policy making.
Well, thank you, and thanks for that good description of nationalism at electron speed, which is, I think, what we have seen here. Well, we've got about 20 minutes left, And so I wanted to open it up to all of you. There'll be microphones coming along. Please tell us who you are and what your question is and who you want to direct it to, and we'll start with you. Thanks.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Kuni Miyake from Tokyo. I just wanted to ask Professor Kim your statement about your concern about Japan, that Japan will be a war-making power. That concerns you. While I share your sentiment, but do you really believe that a democratic Japan is going to be a militarist nation? And when Mr. Sanga, when you say normal, we mean that it's a NATO ally-like. So we just want to be another NATO-like ally to the United States. That's all. So my point is that if our territorial waters are being invaded or entered by foreign vessels, but we don't enter your water areas around Takeshima, which you call Dokdo. We are not challenging by force. But and also you have to fight a war against North Korea if North Korea invades you. But if we are invaded, and we have to be ready, and we may have to defend ourselves, maybe in the form of war. Is this kind of war different from the war you fight? That's my question.
Okay. Actually, when I was talking about a country who can conduct a war, that is not related with the regime type of a particular country. Democratic countries, there are many democratic countries who have the war fighting capability. But Japan has been saying that you have been kind of an abnormal country for a long time since the end of the Pacific War. So that's why you are pursuing a normal state status, right? So you are in the process of achieving that status. So that's why you need to take kind of from your own perspective. I think it would be realistic to pursue kind of a gradualistic approach rather than trying to expand the UN guaranteed kind of a right. So this is kind of the impression, okay, to the neighboring countries. Japan is trying to jumpstart and try to deny so-called the peace constitution, which has been supported not just the Japanese people, but a lot of neighboring countries. So from the realistic point of view, I think Prime Minister Abe and other top Japanese leaders need to put more emphasis on diluting that kind of misunderstanding. And then probably the time will come when Japan, as a democratic state, will be able to enjoy kind of a more right going beyond the right to self-defense, collective self-defense. That was my suggestion, but you might have a different idea. It's not based on the fact. So that's why I emphasize the clear distinction between the normal state and the state pursuing somewhat different status.
Yoshihide-san?
Yes, if I may, I would like to come to the same thing. I wanted to immediately respond to your remark about this collective self-defense, but I sort of restrained myself. But because this was raised again. Miyake-san said that's not facts, and that's one way of saying this, and I'm an academic, so I'll make it a little more complex. I think basically, your interpretation regarding this, which you said a moment ago, I think is, if I may, a typical case of looking at what's happening, substance-wise, through the prism of, your perception of Mr. Abe or his ideology. And as I emphasize, these two are totally different. We know what sort of politician Mr. Abe is as an individual. It's not no news. He's been like that, and he will continue to be, like that in the rest of his life. And but there are two Mr. Abes now. One as an individual politician, the other is Mr. Abe as Prime Minister. They are different. They are different. And Mr. Abe is now talking about proactive internationalism, right? That's a statement coming from Mr. Abe as Prime Minister in the context of policy that he's promoting. But as an individual, we all know that he was somewhat critical about, whatever, Kono statement or Murayama statement. And we consider him as a nationalist. And he has a particular ideology as an individual. But here, as I said, there is disconnect between Mr. Abe as an individual and Mr. Abe as the Prime Minister. And most of the typical interpretation that we've been hearing about these issues, particularly relating to the history, is a statement for us coming from your prism, which is very much affected by how you remember history, and through which you talk about what history is about. And I think this first dimension of how history affects Korean, Chinese particularly, prism through which to discuss history issues, that is also very important, I think, eventually. But that we are not talking about. We are talking about the kind of interpretations coming out through these prisms, and not questioning this prism itself. And I think that's Mr. Light of Collective Self-Defense looks like as Japan trying to engage in war. I mean, that's not true, as Mr. Miyake said. And that's, to us, a total distortion of what's actually happening in Japan, which is the result of this particular prism, I think, which is very much affected by how you look at Mr. Abe as an individual. And as I said, this is a complex thing for ourselves too in Japan. And we have not, necessarily, streamlined these, domestic complex, elements, because people tend to approach these issues from a particular position, rather than appreciating this complex context.
Let me grab just a couple of questions together, and then we'll sort them through. So we'll do here and here. You, sir? And then pass the microphone on down to this gentleman.
Thank you. I'm retired General of Korean Army and former Vice Defense Minister. My question goes to both the panelists from US and China. I want to revisit the North Korean nuclear issues. Yesterday we talked about this issue, but still no solution, no resolution is in sight. President Park Geun-hye once stated that we will no longer live with North Korea nuclear armed. Since both North and South Korea agreed to the joint declaration of the denuclearization of Korean Peninsula in the end of 1991, which was put into effect in February 1992. Since then, after 20 years, 2 decades, North Korea, they made 3 times nuclear tests. During that time, both US and Korea have made all efforts to prevent North Korea from having nuclear weapons. We have bilateral talks, 3-part talks, and 4-party talks. As Kim Sung-hwan mentioned about the Peace Forum, in the late 1990s, we had 4-party talks, including China, US, and both Koreas, to deal with both issues together. One is the Korean peace issues, and another is the nuclear issues. And we have 6-party talks.
Can we,
Yeah.
since we only have a
So-
few minutes left in the panel,
Okay.
can we drive you to your question?
But still, we see no the future, no the resolution is such. So my question is, what is the purpose of U.S. and the United States about the final end solution of the North Korean nuclear program? As you mentioned, still CVID is your aim in dealing with North Korea program, both the U.S. and China. CVID is still alive in your policies towards North Korean nuclear program. Thank you.
Okay, and pass the microphone right on the gentleman here. Yes.
Ben Steele from the Council on Foreign Relations. After the end of the Cold War, one of the major challenges both Western Europe and the United States faced was how to expand both NATO and the European Union westward without both institutions appearing to be fundamentally anti-Russian alliances. Arguably, what we're witnessing now in Ukraine is the end game of both processes. What lessons can we learn for building collective security and political cooperation in East Asia that will hopefully not lead us down the same road vis-a-vis China? David, I'll leave it to your wisdom how to divvy up that question.
Let me turn to Jim first on these, because I think the first gentleman's question was, does CVID live? Maybe you can even answer, is it even our responsibility at the United States to be the one that resolves this question, or is that for all of the other nations on here? And then on the NATO question, anybody who would like to take this, I'd love to hear that as well.
Sure. Yes, the answer is that is our objective and should be our objective. I think that there is no other acceptable resolution of the nuclear problem than denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. And I think that's broadly agreed. The question is how to get there, and given where things are now. And I think that the framework, the 2005 agreement, was a good framework. I think people should be open to ways of modifying that, as long as it's in the context of taking concrete and meaningful steps towards complete denuclearization of the peninsula, because I think the alternative is just way too dangerous and unstable. And not just for the peninsula, by the way, if North Korea is accepted as a nuclear power, but for the broader international community. And on the NATO question, look, this will be debated forever, because there are two fundamentally different theories of the case about what happened at the end of the Cold War. One was, this was a thumb in the eye of Russia, and it was just, it took it while they were down, and the other was, if we had accepted a droit de regard, a right of Russia to determine the security arrangements and Finlandize the rest of Europe, it would have been the beginning of worse stuff of the kind we're seeing now. And, there's no way to resolve that debate. I had it with George Kennan 20 years ago. And I understand the theory that says, oh, you shouldn't have done this to Russia, you've made them feel aggrieved and things. But I deeply believe it was the right decision, that we have to live in a world in which countries are allowed to make their own decisions about their political and security arrangements, and that we need to be sensitive to Russia. And there were lots of efforts to make NATO-Russia partnership, blah, 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 OSCE. But it was all with the understanding that the one thing that would not be tolerable at the end of the Cold War, after everything that had happened in Europe during the Cold War, to say to Poland, to Hungary, to the Balts, no, actually Russia still gets to decide what you're going to be. And I think the same is true in East Asia. I think the fundamental principle in East Asia has to be that the countries of this region should be able to choose their own security arrangements. They don't have to. They could decide, and Korea might decide in the future that it isn't going to be allied formally with the United States after unification. I think there are good reasons for it to be, but that would be a choice that should be available to South Korea. But I don't think China should get to decide for South Korea or anybody else that they can't choose to do that. And I think that basic concept of the right of states to make their own arrangements is an important one, and was the right decision with all the difficulties that we've had in Europe, and is also the right decision that we should be part of one of the core principles about this not final, but the new architecture of a stable East Asia.
Let's see, I think everybody wanted in on this, so we'll start with Professor Kim, and then we'll go right down to Yoshihide.
With respect to the so-called Asian version of NATO, I think from the Korean perspective, Korea doesn't support, for example, Korea, Japan, United States kind of a trilateral military alliance, even though we support tripartite security cooperation vis-a-vis North Korea. Secondly, even though we support Korea, Japan, United States security cooperation, that is not supposed to be targeting China or containment of China. Okay, that is, I'm not in the position of representing the current Korean government, but as far as I understand, that probably reflects the current government's position too. And finally, Mr. Miyake-san, rightly pointed out, my criticism is not based on the fact, but my original intention was that, expansion of the right to self-defense to the warfighting capability is being argued by the ideological rightists of Japan. So I hope Prime Minister Abe doesn't buy that kind of an argument. Okay, then I think E.H. Carr, for example, famous historian, says history is an endless dialogue between past and the present. Okay, so I think if Prime Minister Abe and the top leadership takes that kind of a decent and realistic position, I think we take Japan having kind of a dialogue between the present and the past.
Professor Yoshihide, you want?
Yes, thank you. Just a little footnote to what I said previously about Prime Minister Abe. To clear my position, I myself is rather critical about Prime Minister Abe. That's what I talk about in Japanese media and interviewing externals. So my explanation of it is not an indication of my being a fan of him. So particular media people, if you're going to write about it, please do not say that. And about NATO kind of thing, I think in Asia, as we are all familiar, there is a so-called ASEAN way, which has been perhaps the only effective approach to sort of multilateral, dialogues and eventually, hopefully, security. But as you all know, ASEAN way is a method to start with relatively easy issues. And of course, theoretically speaking, there is the other way of approaching the same, process, which is to start with difficult issues. And if indeed for multilateralism to be really effective, of course, ideally speaking, if we can start with difficult issues and if that will eventually materialize in some form of multilateral, the thing, I think that's ideal, I think. So I'm not saying this is realistic, but ideally, along the line of the thinking, and one possible, candidate of issues should be territorial disputes. And territorial disputes, multilateralize these disputes, And currently, every government refuses to do that. Korea refuses to put the Dokdo issue to any other, beyond the Korean conception. And the Japanese refuses to do that with Senkaku, with China. China refuses to do that with South China Sea and so forth. So currently, there is no hope. But if indeed something would eventually evolve, along the line of multilateralizing what are currently very strictly bilateral, processes. I think that's one area where starting with the difficult issues, eventually culminating to something, more productive multilateralism. But I think for that to happen, we need new thinking. But I'm not hopeful, realistically speaking, but continuing our discussion along that line, I think is important. First of all, that would impact your mind eventually, if you really become, if you start to believe in the value of this. But the alternative is to forget about it, Don't talk about these issues. I think that's the alternative, which may be more realistic, but both seems to be very difficult today. Yeah.
Dr. Yai, you get the last word.
Thank you. First, I want to just give a very brief response to the generous question about China's purpose in the DPRK nuclear issue. I think China has not changed its purpose. It's the nuclearization of the DPRK. China don't want DPRK to be nuclearized. It is against China's interest in every aspect. So in this point, I think there should be no doubt about it. The second thing is that China does not want to see military operations to use military means to achieve denuclearization. China wanted to be achieved through negotiations by peaceful means. And the third thing is that China does not want the change of regime as an objective in the process. And also a very brief response to the NATO enlargement issue and the recent Ukraine lessons, what lessons we can draw from it. From a Chinese perspective, I think the single most important lesson that can be drawn is that regional players' concerns, security concerns of regional players should be paid attention to. And that's why China has been calling constantly that mutual respect of core interests of between China and the United States and between China and other major players in the region should be respected. But we have to define what are these core interests, and we have to understand the red lines, where the red lines are, and to pay special attention not to step over these red lines. Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you. We have not come to the end of these issues, but we have come to the end of our time. So I thank you very much, and I think we're going to have a 10 or 15-minute break, and then we're off into the breakout session. So thank you. Thanks to all the members of the panel.